So today, because fandom's been red hot and febrile, we wanted to kind of grasp the nettle a little bit. So we've got a few discussion points this afternoon. So we'll start with our first one. So if I just kind of give us an intro so our audience can see what we're going to be debating per se. Okay. Yes, a tricky one, isn't it, folks, to actually be talking about canon, because canon, as you know, can be quite an issue. Now, as I've got there, and I'll take it away in a moment, is canon and Doctor Who mythology destroying good creativity, good story writing? Who wants to start us off?
Well, you know me, I'm not one to lay my light under a bushel. The answer to that is there's lots of various things you can say about that. Doctor Who fans are very precious about their programme. And because you invest in a show that has a history like Doctor Who has, we all get a little sense of a thrill when something that's mentioned, or a returning villain or companion or monster from the past, and we were there to see it. We can all get excited by that, and we can all enjoy that. And we get that extra thrill, perhaps, than the casual viewer does when it's something perhaps that only we remember or we're geeky enough to know about. But there's another side of canon, if you like, in that you become a slave to it. And people who think they own Doctor Who because they know or know virtually everything about it in terms of its canonicity. So there's previousness with Doctor Who. If you look at the 1980s, where John Nathan Turner had special advisors, and we know who I'm talking about here, which were fans who fed into that process. And basically, because the fans at that point were appreciating a lot of the canon that was being used to feed into current stories, the producer thought it was popular and devised a whole lot of shows around that. And that strangled creativity for Doctor Who in the 80s, and it probably did the damage which ultimately led to its demise in the later 80s, because if you like, a lot of the casual viewers got fed up with Doctor Who. They found it's maybe a bit introspective, a bit staring up its own backside, referring to its own past, too self-referential, call it what you will. And it was only latterly when a new script editor who basically parked the canon stuff, and I'm talking about Andrew Carmel here, and introduced sort of new mystery to the character and some quite interesting storylines, that the programme really started to come alive again for a lot of us. But by that time, the damage was done. And the BBC High Agents, which is a phrase we use here in Glasgow to talk about the big bosses, decided that the die was cast and Doctor Who had to go. So, yeah, canon can strangle creativity to the extent that if you allow the tail to wag the dog, ultimately you might have, and I'm going to put the fingers in my dog's ears, you might have to take the dog to the vet, because ultimately it's not a very good thing to do. Let the tail wag itself, yeah. And I know I've mixed so many metaphors there that people might try to sail up into the sunset. But yes, in a word, yeah, canon can strangle creativity. It can also promote creativity if it's done properly.
Anyone want to join in at this point? I don't want to butt in too early because there's
I mean, yeah, I think John's right. I think the thing about it is that you can be way too precious about certain things. So, I mean, first of all, you have to remember that the story, as so many sort of classic television stories, didn't have a canon to start with. It wasn't created with this book that said this is what has to happen. So it started with an air of mystery that is unrivaled, in my opinion, in any other piece of television. That first episode is the greatest piece of television ever, and I will sort of like go on about that quite fairly frequently. But I think then you have to accept that anything that lasts for any amount of time creates tradition. You then work within it. but you also have to break out of it now and then, because otherwise it becomes restrictive and sclerotic, and you don't have the creativity, you don't have the choice. So I think it's about there's definitely something to do with a balance. It allows some structure, but now and again you just have to go that that's not the important thing.
Yeah, I mean, look, we're not even 24 hours after what they called a bi-regeneration, which would be the latest, big discussion and controversy in Doctor Who, saying, well, it's not canon. This is clearly a new thing. But, as you've just said, Hugh, one of the great examples was in 1966, of course, at the end of the 10th Planet. They did something that hadn't been set up in the mythology earlier. It had never been referred to by the William Hartnell Doctor. This was never discussed. There was a hint of it behind the scenes in Celestial Toymaker, but that was it. And of course, so yeah, you make your own canon as you go along, which makes me wonder why sometimes we as fans sometimes get very heated about, say, a bi-regeneration. Or another example I had was the Watcher. I mean, the Watcher, we all seem to, I think, do I speak for us all? I mean, with Logopolis, the Watcher was a kind of really interesting kind of aspects of the Tom Baker regeneration, but I feel as though fandom hasn't really questioned it and said that wasn't canon. They've just taken it as an interesting point. Yeah. I sometimes wonder whether, because I think, of course, The Timeless Children was the classic where people got to maybe animated. Is it actually? I mean, the question is canon strangling good story writing? I sometimes wonder whether you can change canon with a good story. But if it's badly written, as I personally think Timeless Children was, because there was a lot of recount at the end and exposition, that killed the idea, because it was really, I felt I was in the classroom being told some strange canon. What's your thoughts, Niall? I haven't brought you in yet.
Mixed, in a word. I think you have a show as long as Doctor Who, and I think that, judging by the comments of the panelists, we've all been fans for a long time, so we know our stuff. I think that when the show was taken off air, I think there's a tendency for people to feel ownership, that actually if it wasn't for the fans, it would never have come back, and all that kind of stuff, which you could argue is correct. But then equally, the show shouldn't be for the fans, the show should be for the casual viewer. So stories like, for example, Attack of the Cybermen, that are based on a subplot of the 10th Planet, 20 years earlier, if you're a casual viewer, how are you going to understand that? So I kind of think, I guess my answer is actually canon should be done lightly. So canon should be about kind of the odd nod to a previous adventure, where if you're a long-term viewer, you can appreciate that, and you can kind of think, oh yeah, that's nice. But actually, if you've got stories that are based on somebody's knowledge of a 6-year-old show, that's not good. You're gonna alienate the casual viewers, and actually what will happen, as I think it probably did in the late 80s, it just becomes a really insular cult show and then dies, because you're not adding to your audience space.
Do you think, does the panel think, actually, what I was saying there really was, if you set it out well, if you really look as though you've established a context, not in an expository way, but you actually do weave it into the plot, and it becomes kind of very real. I mean, I've said it twice already now, The Deadly Assassin, Robert Holmes told such a really good story that you actually just bought into The Matrix. I mean, everybody in Doctor Who, does anybody in Doctor Who challenge The Matrix as an idea now, or do they just take it as it's canon? Matrix is a really good idea. The Matrix has changed when we had the Trial of a Time Lord, the Matrix idea, the key to the Matrix and all this stuff. It's all got tweaked. But The Deadly Assassin, I would, posit, was a very strong 4-episode story. It established hierarchy, it established a caste system, it established the Matrix, it established the outer kind of forbidden world. It established so many things, and I don't hear much challenging of that. And yet, look at what I've got on the screen now. We know that Twitter and everything is on fire discussing whether they will accept this. So I wonder if is it because it's well written, well told, it's kind of really integral to the plot and not like an add-on. I mean, we weren't given any hint of this bio-regeneration apart from on Twitter or X, were we?
No, and why should we? But I remember the backlash at the time from Deadly Assassin. Yes, I'm that old. And as usual, the Time Lords were supposed to be ethereal beings, hovering above everything, and they were shown to be a bunch of doddering old men. I thought it was a fantastic turn because it just humanized them, or Gallifreyanized them, for want of a better phrase. It just made them more relatable, and it introduced better plotline stories, if you like, to involve the Time Lords. But fans, as always, they're Johnny-come-latelys. The ordinary punter sitting watching it and enjoying a good story, and geeky sort of fans are sitting there sort of dropping their knitting and just worrying about the Time Lords were never like this before. I dare say, had there been organised fandom in 1966 when Patrick Troughton took his first breath as the Doctor, there would have been outrage about the fact that he'd replaced William Hartnell. But the fact is, but for that addition to canonicity, but for that change in the Doctor, the programme wouldn't have existed anymore for people to complain about not sticking to the canon that came and was created thereafter. It's just about getting it real. It's good to be a fan. It's good to appreciate something, but you have to recognise, again, and I mentioned Andrew Cartmel. He once asked the head of drama, the head of drama asked him, who's Doctor Who for? And he replied, Doctor Who is for everybody. And the head of drama said, no, it's for children. And of course, Andrew Cartmel was right. Doctor Who's for everybody. And that means even the person who just strays onto a channel or onto a streaming platform at any particular point. So it has to be accessible, but it can be rewarding. But just in the same way that I'm not a mega fan of other programs, I like little references here and there. I like to see returning characters from other shows as well. So that's all well and good, and it can enhance the potential for storylines. But the minute you become dictated by that and just become up in arms because something which you thought was a fact before is no longer a fact and get all aerated about it, it's just nonsense and silly. And, fans end up just...
Is it because...
And if Twitter is on fire, or X is whatever it's called, don't call the brigade. Let's hope it burns to the ground because it's a dreadful place anyway.
Is it? I sometimes wonder. Is it because we've just, been? Yeah, we are diehard fans. We've been through it for decades, and so there's that invested time. So that suddenly there's that proprietorial element. When actually you're referring to when you were a kid, John, watching Deadly Assassin. I dare say you're saying you accepted it because you were open to new ideas.
Yeah, and it was a good story. And by doing what they did and change the sort of, if you like, the whole ethos of Gallifrey and what the Time Lord Society was all about, it allowed this, what is now and still my favourite Doctor Who story of all time, The Deadly Assassin, to happen. And you had that creativity not been allowed, had the producer not been open to saying to Robert Holmes, yeah, go with it, let's do this, that story would never have existed. He'd come along and said, no. The Time Lords were big flowing gowns and float above everybody else with a pious tone. He didn't. He allowed Robert Holmes to write it. He allowed the creatives to get behind it. And we now have what I consider to be the best story of Doctor Who of all time.
Can I just pick up on that? Because I think it's interesting. The great thing about The Deadly Assassin, it's not my favourite story of all time, but we'll obviously get on to that at some other stage. I think the great thing about that, and a lot of the stories since, whenever they really hit, have something to do with the time. So the satire that was within that, about a sort of governing structure, was important at the time. And I think you've got to allow that as well. When I was talking to John last week, I'm very conscious of the fact that whenever the new series started in 2005, you now have people who watched that as kids who have kids. And it's a different world now.
That's scary.
So it has to respond to that change in time. And that's, to me, the best reason for changing canon and creativity is because it's relevant to the time. It will always have a certain sense of being relevant to all times. Obviously, we are talking about Doctor Who here, but I think it also has to be reasonably responsive to the time it's being made in. Otherwise, it doesn't pick up on the real details of what's going on.
I totally agree with that. I was just thinking myself, actually, that you think about kind of big canon moments in Doctor Who. I was thinking about the way the Time Lords are portrayed in the War Games, and you kind of think at that point it's the height of the Cold War. There's massive fears about nuclear Armageddon. So this whole idea that there's these kind of Time Lords that are kind of ethereal and they're good and all knowing, they can come and save us and rescue us. But then by the time you get to the Deadly Assassin, it's kind of like sci-fi. The trends there about kind of this kind of used universe, like in Star Wars, then going on into things like Blade Runner and Aliens. And actually, the Time Lords by that point, it's a lot more political. They're a lot more underhanded. So,
yeah,
I guess what I'm saying is that actually canon is affected by the fact that it's a it's a commercial television show. It's got to be relevant, so it's got to link in with the period of the time, just as you were saying. So, yeah, I agree with that.
But, and also, sorry, Brendan, to say, and also the format of the program is flexible enough to so that when you take sort of like totemic figures like the Time Lord and knock them off the pedestal, what does the show do? It creates the Guardians of Time, the black and the white Guardians, which then become, if you like, the all-powerful beings of the universe and all the rest of it, and replaces what the Time Lords. I mean, we've used the Time Lords, for the story. They're not as all-powerful or as honest and true as we were made to believe. So now we can create something else and do that. And that's what Doctor Who is about. It's just the format's so flexible. If you destroy one, there shiveth. I mean, there'll be another wall in a minute.
How far do we go? I understand a lot of what you were saying. For example, you've mentioned as a panel, we've mentioned the Deadly Assassin reflecting its time, the War Games reflecting its time. I think Robert Holmes, the Celestial Intervention Agency, was a skit on the CIA, of course, and we just had Watergate and everything. So I buy that completely.
Had he just not watched the Manchurian Candidate, Robert Holmes?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That was totally it, wasn't it? But no, there were reflecting time. So how far? We've said how flexible Doctor Who as a kind of genre is really within itself. So we don't want canon to strangle good story writing, because we always want a good Doctor Who story. But what would be the limit? What would be your taboo? How far could we go with Doctor Who till we break it? So at the moment, we're reflecting an awful lot of issues to do with cultural appropriation. It was discussed last night by RTD again. He talked about able-bodied and wheelchair-bound. Recently, because of the cultural sensitivities have changed, he's reflecting that. I assume you're arguing, just like Robert Holmes reflected Watergate, Manchurian Candidate, etc. But how far would you accept change? Is there a limit to John, Niall, and Hugh?
Well, personally,
what cannot be changed in Doctor Who?
In terms of, you mean for us personally?
Yeah.
Would it make a switch off?
Yeah. What would really say, no, come on, you're going too far there?
I think they just did that. But again, the flexibility of the format is that they can sort of, and he did it last night in the line from the Toymaker. They basically retconned the whole timeless child thing. So again, the flexibility of the format. We don't know who the Doctor was initially. Then as time passed, we discovered he was a Time Lord from Gallifrey, and he had 12 regenerations, 13 lives. When we hit that buffer, we changed the canon again and moved on. And now we've got the first female Doctor, and we can quibble about how that was handled. But nonetheless, it didn't break the canon. It was allowed because it had been set up with the Master and Missy and various other different things that happened with Time Laws and stuff. But I think the showrunner at that time probably stretched people's credulity with some of the stuff that can, because eventually the Doctor wasn't a Gallifrey. He was somewhere else, and William Hartnell wasn't the first Doctor. It wasn't so much the fact that stretched my patience. It was just the fact that it was, to me, it was the action of a showrunner throwing everything at the screen because he hadn't handled the running of the show properly. And so, last act of The Scoundrel, dealing with the mythos of the programme in order to have a legacy, if you like. But having said that, the show came back, and a bit of that may well have been, although it's up for debate, may well have been retconned last night. But personally, I still stuck with it. I saw every single episode of the 13th Doctor, show run by Chris Chibnall. I liked some of it. I didn't like most of it. But that wasn't because of the cast or the crew. It was because of the writing. However, I'm still here.
Yeah. You've got a limit, Hugh? A limit?
not for me. I mean, the closest I think, yeah, I would say that in the past where I've struggled was the portrayal of uh, Colin Baker's Doctor for a substantial length of time as not being a particularly nice person. And I get that he's meant to be alien, but that I really struggled with that at the time and thought, that might be problematic. Although over a period of time, I warmed to it slightly, but then they toned it down. I think it's almost impossible to break. It really is, because I was sitting here trying to think of something which I don't think works, and no, nothing. The stuff that I always think about in terms of the Chibnall stuff, which I just didn't think was well explained, as I think most of us have said, is in some ways it's not that much different to the stuff that Andrew Cartmel was suggesting. And part of the reason why Andrew Cartmel's stuff seemed to work to me was the mystery was kept there. Yeah. And I think that's a thing. I think over-explaining stuff, that's a real problem. But that's just about storytelling. It's not about the thing you're over-explaining.
Yeah, I get you. Niall?
I think just again, following on from earlier comments, I think to answer your question, I think that with Doctor Who, as long as there's always a reset button, as long as there's a way to go back, you can't ever break it, because you can have and thinking about things like the Big Finish series where they've stuck the 8th Doctor on Earth and he hasn't got access to the TARDIS. Even that I find really interesting, because there's themes there that I think, what would the Doctor be like if he's stuck without the TARDIS? How would that work? How can you go from traveling through time and space to struggling to pay your gas bill? How, all that kind of stuff. It's really interesting. But as long as there's a way back from that, so as long as at some point, because I think ultimately the Doctor Who is about an alien in a police box traveling around righting wrongs. That's the basic premise of the show. If you go away from that, then fine, but you've got to be able to find your way back. I didn't actually mind the Timeless Child storyline. I'm probably in the minority there, but my husband and I, we did a rewatch of it recently and actually really enjoyed it. But I do agree that actually there were ideas in there that weren't expanded upon maybe as fully as they should be. And I kind of think that actually that's probably really alienating for some people. For me, I really enjoyed the callbacks to the Brains of Morbius, where it's actually now we know who all these people were in the mind-bending scene. But again, going back to what we were talking about, canon, actually, should you really be focusing that on an episode? Because if you're a casual viewer, what's that going to mean to you? Just going back to what you said about Colin Baker, I think I really enjoyed Colin Baker as a Doctor, but I would say the first story after he regenerated, there's that scene where he tries to strangle Perry. That should never happen. The Doctor should always be a safety figure. You should never mess around with that, and I think that was a mistake. But that being said, just to answer the question, I think you can stretch canon, and I think you can explore ideas with it, but there has to be a way back.
And I think a lot of us are saying here that we're fans, for God's sake. I mean, I was hearing rumors about the police box going and this happening, and I was thinking, no, but I'll come back. The thing is, I'll stick with it. And the other thing is, we've kind of said it through some of our answers, which is, if it's canon all the time that dominates and is the boss, you're always looking back. And surely you want a program that looks forward and is advancing. And
but canon is not something set in stone. You can take something from the past, reshape it, and progress it. For example, one of Chibnall's last efforts, because for a showrunner who started with a clean slate, and it was the biggest jumping on point in a few years for any viewers, because new Doctor, new companions. There was nothing about the past you needed to really know. There was just a series of adventures. And that was a great and, well-meant premise. It was just written by. The phrase I used at the time was all very vanilla. It just didn't go anywhere. It was all sort of on one level. But right at the end, he started bringing back a whole lot of other characters and creatures and monsters, because he was trying to make a lot of this stick for legacy purposes. And for example, we got, to go back to canon, the Sea Devils and the idea that they had been on Earth before the Doctor. Now, they brought the sea devils back, and they look far, far better than they've ever looked in terms of the CGI and how it's certainly better than last time they were brought back in Doctor Who and Warriors of the Deep. But it was a badly written, badly directed, badly edited story. And it wasn't the canon that killed that.
Yeah.
It was the writing and the production that killed it.
And
Canon could have got us a wonderful story and introduced the population again to a wonderful creation, the Sea Devils, and the fact that, the premise is great, that human beings are in fact the aliens. Doctor got that so right, in the second story of its confinement to Earth, when it was supposed to be, when we're told you get two storylines, Invasion Earth and Mad Scientist, and Doctor Who proved them wrong in the second story, that we were the invaders, that we'd taken over from the Silurians at that point. But so they brought them back and have introduced them to a whole new audience and made them really, really good. But unfortunately, the story was so awful that it's left a bad taste in the mouth. So canon good there, bad production.